I never thought I'd be the type of person to care about office politics. But here I am, 3 months after what I now call the Great Coffee Incident, still thinking about how a simple misunderstanding nearly destroyed my career. My name is David, I'm 31, and I work as a data analyst for a mid-sized consulting firm in Minneapolis. It's the kind of place where people wear khakis and button-downs, where the biggest excitement usually comes from someone bringing donuts on Friday morning. I've always been what you'd call a creature of habit. Every morning at exactly 8:47, I'd walk to the break room, pour myself a cup of coffee from the communal pot, add 2 sugars and a splash of cream, and head back to my desk. It was my routine, my small moment of peace before diving into spreadsheets and pivot tables. The trouble started on a Tuesday in March. I was running about 10 minutes behind schedule because of a delayed train. So instead of my usual 8:47 coffee run, I didn't make it to the break room until almost 9:15. The pot was nearly empty, just enough for maybe half a cup of that bitter overbrewed sludge that sits there all morning. But sitting next to the coffee maker was a French press, gleaming and full of what looked like perfectly brewed coffee. There was no name on it, no note, nothing to indicate it belonged to anyone specific. In my sleepy, caffeine-deprived state, I figured someone had made extra and left it for the team. It wouldn't be the first time. We had a pretty generous office culture when it came to sharing food and drinks, so I poured myself a cup. It was incredible, rich and smooth, with hints of chocolate and caramel. Best coffee I'd ever had in that office. I savoured every sip, feeling more human with each one. I even went back for a second cup around 10:30, thinking whoever made this deserved a thank you note. It wasn't until lunch that I learned the truth. I was heating up my sad desk salad in the microwave when Jennifer from accounting stormed into the break room, her face flushed with anger. Jennifer was one of those people who took everything personally, the type who'd send passive-aggressive emails about dirty dishes in the sink. She looked around frantically, then zeroed in on the empty French press sitting by the sink. Her voice, when she spoke, was shaking with rage. Someone drank my coffee, my entire French press of coffee that I brought from home. She was talking to nobody in particular, but loud enough for half the office to hear. My stomach dropped. That beautiful, perfect coffee that had made my morning, I'd stolen it, without thinking, without asking. I'd taken something that belonged to someone else. I felt like a complete idiot, but the damage was done. I walked over to Jennifer, ready to apologise and offer to replace her coffee, maybe even buy her a bag of whatever premium beans she'd used, but before I could say a word, she continued her rant. This is exactly the kind of selfish behaviour that's ruining this workplace. People think they can just take whatever they want without consequences. I opened my mouth to confess, but she kept going. I bet it was someone from the marketing department. They're always acting like they own the place, taking up meeting rooms, leaving messes everywhere. Probably that new guy, Alex. He has that entitled look about him. Alex was standing right there, holding his own coffee mug, looking completely bewildered. He'd only been with the company for 2 weeks, seemed like a nice enough guy, maybe a little eager to please, but hardly the office villain Jennifer was painting him as. "I didn't touch your coffee," Alex said quietly. "I don't even drink coffee. I'm more of a tea person." Jennifer's eyes narrowed. "Right, sure you are. I suppose the French press just emptied itself." I watched this innocent man get accused of something I'd done, watched him try to defend himself, while Jennifer worked herself into an even bigger fury. The smart thing, the right thing, would have been to step forward and clear the air, but I froze. Maybe it was cowardice, maybe it was the fear of becoming Jennifer's target, but I just stood there, like a statue. The situation escalated quickly. Jennifer marched straight to our supervisor, Linda, and demanded an investigation into the coffee theft. Linda, to her credit, tried to treat it as the minor misunderstanding it should have been, but Jennifer wasn't having it. She wanted justice, she wanted accountability, she wanted someone to pay for her missing coffee. By the end of the week, there was a new policy posted in the break room. All personal food and beverages had to be labelled with names and dates. The communal coffee fund was suspended, pending a review of breakroom etiquette. Someone had to attend a mandatory workshop on workplace respect and property boundaries. Alex became increasingly isolated. People started avoiding him, not because they necessarily believed he was a coffee thief, but because being associated with drama in our office was social suicide. He'd eat lunch alone, work late to avoid the awkward small talk, and I could see the enthusiasm draining out of him day by day. Meanwhile, I was drowning in guilt. Every time I saw Alex sitting by himself, every time Jennifer made another snide comment about people who can't respect other people's property, I felt sick. I'd created this mess with my thoughtless mistake, and now an innocent person was paying the price. The breaking point came 3 weeks later. Alex had been putting in extra hours, trying to prove himself, trying to show that he was a team player, despite the coffee incident. He'd volunteered for every project, stayed late to help with urgent deadlines, and generally bent over backward to rehabilitate his reputation. But Jennifer wasn't satisfied. During a team meeting, she brought up the coffee situation again, suggesting that maybe people who couldn't be trusted with small things shouldn't be trusted with important client work. It was a direct attack on Alex's competence and character, and I watched him shrink in his chair as she spoke. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my grandfather, who used to tell me that a man's character isn't measured by his mistakes, but by how he handles them. I'd made a mistake, that was human, but letting someone else suffer for it, that was something else entirely. The next morning, I got to the office early and asked Linda if I could speak with her privately. I told her everything, from my delayed train to my assumption about the communal coffee to my cowardice in not speaking up sooner. I expected anger, disappointment, maybe even disciplinary action. Instead, Linda just sighed. "You know, I figured it was something like this. Jennifer has a tendency to blow things out of proportion, and Alex never struck me as the type to steal coffee. I was hoping whoever really did it would come forward eventually." She called a brief team meeting that afternoon. I stood in front of my colleagues and confessed to the great coffee incident of March. I apologized to Jennifer for taking her coffee without permission, and I apologized to Alex for letting him take the blame for something he didn't do. Jennifer's reaction was interesting. Instead of the vindication I expected her to feel, she seemed almost disappointed that the mystery was solved so simply. She'd built up this elaborate narrative of workplace theft and disrespect, and the reality was just a tired guy who made an honest mistake. Alex, on the other hand, was gracious beyond belief. He thanked me for coming forward and said he understood how these things could happen. He didn't seem angry, just relieved that the cloud hanging over him was finally lifting. The aftermath was surprisingly positive. The team seemed to respect that I'd eventually done the right thing, even if it took me longer than it should have. Jennifer and I never became friends, but the tension eased. Alex settled into his role and became one of the most reliable people on our team. I learned something important about myself during those weeks of watching an innocent person suffer for my mistake. I learned that small acts of cowardice can have big consequences, that silence in the face of injustice makes you complicit in it. I also learned that it's never too late to do the right thing, even when it's uncomfortable. These days, I still drink coffee every morning at 8:47. But now I always check if there's a name on anything before I pour myself a cup. And when I make mistakes, which I still do regularly, I try to own them quickly instead of letting them fester into something bigger and more harmful. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the smallest incidents. And sometimes being a good person means admitting when you've been a bad one. That's the end of that story. It's wild how something as simple as coffee can spiral into such workplace drama, but I respect that he eventually came clean. It takes real courage to admit your mistakes, especially when someone else is already taking the heat. Now let me share another story that caught my attention. This one about family dynamics and the complicated nature of forgiveness. This next story deals with something we've all probably experienced in some form. That moment when you realise a friendship isn't what you thought it was. My name is Rebecca, and I'm 27 years old. For the past 8 years, I thought I had found my person in college. You know, that friend who just gets you, who you can call at 2 a.m. when your world is falling apart, who celebrates your wins like they're her own. That was supposed to be Emma. We met during freshman orientation at State, bonding over our shared love of terrible reality TV and our mutual hatred of our dorm's broken air conditioning. By sophomore year, we were inseparable. We'd study together at the library until closing, take weekend trips to nearby cities, and spend hours talking about our dreams and fears and everything in between. Emma was the kind of friend who remembered the little things. She'd bring me soup when I was sick, send me funny memes during boring lectures, and always knew exactly what to say when I was stressed about exams or boys or family drama. I thought I was the same kind of friend to her. After graduation, we both ended up in Chicago, which felt like fate. Emma got a job at a marketing agency downtown, and I started working as a graphic designer for a small non-profit. We lived about 20 minutes apart and made it a point to see each other at least twice a week. Sunday brunch became our sacred tradition. For 6 years, this arrangement worked perfectly. We were each other's plus ones to weddings, each other's emergency contacts, each other's chosen family, in a city where we didn't have relatives nearby. When Emma's dad had his heart attack junior year, I was the first person she called. When I went through my brutal breakup with Jake, Emma showed up at my apartment with ice cream and tissues without me even asking. But looking back now, I can see the cracks that were always there. The subtle ways Emma made everything about herself. How she'd listen to my problems but somehow always steer the conversation back to her own issues. How she'd get weird and distant whenever something good happened to me, then bounce back to normal a few days later. I told myself these were just quirks, that all friendships have their rough patches. Emma was going through a lot with her job, her family, her on and off relationship with this guy, Trevor. I made excuses for her behaviour, because that's what good friends do, right? The real trouble started about 10 months ago, when I got promoted at work. It wasn't anything huge, just a step up to senior designer with a modest salary increase. But I was excited. I'd been working toward this for 3 years, putting in extra hours, taking on difficult projects, really proving myself. I called Emma right after my boss gave me the news, expecting her to be thrilled for me. Instead, her response was lukewarm, at best. "Oh, that's nice," she said, her voice flat. "I guess they finally noticed all that overtime you've been putting in." I brushed it off. Maybe she was having a bad day, maybe she was distracted. But when we met for brunch that Sunday, she barely acknowledged my promotion. Instead, she spent the entire meal complaining about her own job, how her boss didn't appreciate her, how she was definitely more qualified than her recently promoted co-worker. The pattern continued over the following weeks. Whenever I brought up anything positive happening in my life, Emma would either change the subject or find a way to diminish it. When I mentioned that I was finally able to afford a nicer apartment, she pointed out how expensive rent was getting, and how I'd probably struggle to keep up with the payments. When I talked about the cute guy I'd started dating, she immediately launched into a story about how all men are basically garbage. I started censoring myself around her, downplaying good news, avoiding topics that might trigger her negativity. It felt like walking on eggshells with someone who was supposed to be my closest friend. The breaking point came during my birthday dinner in September. I'd planned a small celebration at this Italian place we both loved, invited maybe 8 people total. Emma arrived an hour late, which wasn't unusual for her, but she seemed off from the moment she sat down. Throughout dinner, she was checking her phone constantly, giving one-word answers to questions, generally acting like she'd rather be anywhere else. When the server brought out the cake I'd ordered for myself, Emma didn't even look up from her phone. But the real kicker came when my friend Lisa asked about my recent promotion and the new project I was heading up. I started explaining how excited I was about the creative direction we were taking, and Emma literally rolled her eyes and said, "God, do we have to talk about work? It's supposed to be a party." The table went quiet. Lisa looked confused and a little hurt on my behalf. I felt humiliated, like a child who'd been scolded for being too enthusiastic about something important to them. I didn't say anything in the moment because I didn't want to cause a scene at my own birthday dinner, but the rest of the evening felt tainted. Emma left early, claiming she had a headache, and barely said goodbye. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the evening, but also the past few months, and slowly began to see a pattern I'd been ignoring. Emma wasn't happy for me when good things happened. She wasn't supportive when I needed encouragement. She wasn't really being a friend at all. I decided to test my theory. Over the next few weeks, I paid closer attention to our interactions. When Emma complained about her job, I listened and offered advice and support like always. But when I shared my own news, good or bad, she'd either dismiss it or somehow make it about herself. The final confirmation came when I told her I'd been asked to speak at a design conference in Portland. It was a huge opportunity for me, something I'd dreamed about for years. Emma's response was immediate and cutting. "Well, I hope you don't embarrass yourself. Public speaking isn't really your thing, is it?" I stared at her across the coffee shop table, genuinely shocked. This was supposed to be my best friend, the person who knew me better than anyone, and she was actively trying to undermine my confidence about something I was genuinely excited about. That's when I realised that Emma had never really been happy for me, not once in 8 years. She'd been there for the bad times because misery loves company, but she couldn't handle my successes because they highlighted what she felt was missing in her own life. I started pulling back gradually. I stopped initiating our hangouts, stopped calling her first when something happened, stopped treating her like the automatic +1 to everything in my life. Emma noticed, of course, but instead of asking what was wrong or trying to repair things, she just got angry. She started making passive-aggressive comments about how I'd changed since my promotion, how success had gone to my head, how I was becoming one of those people who forgot their friends. The irony was incredible. She was accusing me of the exact behaviour she'd been exhibiting for months. The end came during what turned out to be our last brunch together. Emma was complaining about feeling stuck in her life, and I offered some genuine advice about networking and maybe looking for new opportunities. She snapped at me, saying I couldn't possibly understand because everything just fell into my lap. I finally lost it. 8 years of friendship, 8 years of supporting her through every crisis and celebration, and she thought my success just fell into my lap. I told her exactly what I thought about her attitude, about how she'd been treating me, about how exhausting it was to have a friend who could only be happy when you were miserable. She accused me of being selfish and jealous of the attention she got from others. I pointed out that I'd been nothing but supportive, while she'd been actively discouraging about everything good in my life. The argument escalated quickly, voices raised, other diners staring, the whole dramatic scene I'd been trying to avoid for months. Emma stormed out, leaving me with the check and a table full of cold food. I sat there for another 20 minutes, partly in shock, partly relieved that it was finally over. We haven't spoken since that day in November. I see her posts on social media occasionally, and she seems to be doing well, hanging out with other friends, posting the same kind of content she always did. Sometimes I wonder if she even misses our friendship, or if I was just a convenient emotional dumping ground for her. The hardest part has been accepting that our entire friendship might have been one-sided, that for 8 years I was giving emotional support and loyalty to someone who saw me as competition rather than a true friend, that all those memories I treasured, all those moments I thought we were genuinely connecting, might have meant something completely different to her. I've made new friends since then, people who celebrate my wins and support me through challenges, people who don't see my success as a threat to their own happiness. It's shown me what real friendship looks like, and honestly, it makes me a little sad for what I thought I had with Emma. I don't hate her. I think she's probably struggling with her own insecurities and using other people's failures to make herself feel better. But I've learned that you can't fix someone else's relationship with success and happiness. You can't make someone be genuinely happy for you if they're not capable of it. These days, I'm more careful about the energy I invest in relationships. I pay attention to how people react when good things happen to me, not just how they respond when I'm struggling. Because true friends should be able to celebrate your joy, not just comfort your pain. That friendship taught me a valuable lesson about recognizing when someone is in your life for the wrong reasons. Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones secretly hoping we don't succeed, and learning to identify that dynamic early can save you years of emotional exhaustion. Now I surround myself with people who genuinely want to see me thrive, and the difference in my mental health and overall happiness has been remarkable. Sometimes losing a toxic friendship is actually the best thing that can happen to you. That story really hits different when you realize how many relationships in our lives might actually be one-sided like that. It takes real strength to walk away from someone you've invested years in, even when you know they're not truly supporting you. Here's another story that explores a completely different kind of relationship dynamic, one that shows how assumptions can completely derail our understanding of the people closest to us. I'm 34 years old, my name is Michael, and I've been married to my wife Lisa for 7 years. We have what most people would consider a pretty solid relationship. We communicate well, rarely fight, share similar values and life goals. But about 4 months ago, I discovered something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the woman I married. It started with small things I began noticing around the house. Lisa had always been organised, but lately she'd become almost obsessively so. Every surface was spotless, every item had its exact place, and she'd get visibly anxious if anything was out of order. She started making lists for everything, from grocery shopping to weekend chores, and would check items off with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the task. At first, I attributed it to work stress. Lisa's job as an elementary school teacher had become increasingly demanding, with new curriculum requirements and administrative pressures. I figured she was just channeling her stress into controlling her home environment, which seemed like a pretty normal coping mechanism. But then I started noticing other changes. Lisa began going to bed much earlier than usual, sometimes as early as 8:30 p.m, claiming she was exhausted. She'd always been a social person, but she started declining invitations to hang out with friends, saying she just wanted to stay home and relax. Most concerning was how she'd react to unexpected changes in our routine. If I suggested going out to dinner instead of cooking at home, or if I invited friends over without much advance notice, Lisa would get this look of panic in her eyes. She'd agree to whatever I suggested, but I could see the stress it caused her. I tried talking to her about it several times, asking if everything was okay, if there was anything she wanted to discuss. Each time she'd give me a reassuring smile and say she was just tired, that the school year was taking more out of her than usual. She'd promised to relax more on the weekends, maybe take a vacation day here and there. The turning point came on a Saturday morning in late October. I'd gotten up early to go for a run, and when I came back, I found Lisa sitting at our kitchen table with her laptop open, typing furiously. She was so focused that she didn't even notice me come in. As I walked past her to get some water, I glanced at her screen and saw that she was working on what looked like lesson plans. But it was Saturday morning, and she'd already spent most of Friday evening preparing for the upcoming week. I couldn't understand why she was putting in so many extra hours. "Babe, you're working again?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "I thought we agreed you'd try to disconnect on weekends." Lisa jumped, quickly closing the laptop. "Oh, I was just finishing up a few things. I'm done now." But she looked guilty, like I'd caught her doing something wrong. That afternoon, while Lisa was grocery shopping, her laptop was still on the kitchen table. I told myself I was just going to close it and put it away, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened it, expecting to see teaching materials or school emails. Instead, I found document after document of what appeared to be creative writing. Stories, character sketches, detailed plot outlines. And they weren't just random scribblings, they were polished, professional-looking pieces. Some were complete short stories, others seemed to be chapters of a longer work. I was stunned. In 7 years of marriage, Lisa had never mentioned any interest in creative writing. She'd never talked about wanting to be a writer, never shared any creative projects with me. Yet here was evidence that she'd been working on what looked like a substantial body of work. I started reading one of the stories, and I was immediately struck by how good it was. The characters felt real and complex, the dialogue was natural, and the plot was engaging. This wasn't amateur writing. This was the work of someone with real talent and experience. As I continued reading, I found folders organized by genre: science fiction, romance, literary fiction, even some poetry. There were submission guidelines for literary magazines, rejection letters from publishers, and correspondence with what appeared to be other writers. Lisa had an entire secret creative life that I knew nothing about. When she came home from the store, I was still sitting at the table with her laptop open. She saw what I was looking at, and her face went completely pale. "I can explain," she said quietly, setting the grocery bags down on the counter. I looked at her, this woman I'd been married to for 7 years, and realized I felt like I was meeting a stranger. "How long have you been writing?" I asked. She sat down across from me, looking more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. "Since college, maybe even before that. I've always written, but I got more serious about it a few years ago." "A few years ago? Lisa, why didn't you tell me? Why keep this secret?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. "Because I was afraid you'd think it was silly, or impractical, or that you'd want me to choose between teaching and writing." I was hurt and confused. Had I ever given her reason to think I wouldn't support her creative interests? Had I somehow created an environment where she felt she couldn't share something so important with me? "Have you been published?" I asked, though based on what I'd seen, I suspected the answer was yes. She nodded. "A few short stories in literary magazines, nothing major, but it felt like progress." I sat there trying to process this information. My wife was a published writer, something she'd been working toward for years, and she'd never told me. She'd been celebrating these achievements alone, dealing with rejections alone, nurturing this entire part of herself in secret. Over the next few hours, Lisa opened up about her writing life. She told me about the online writing groups she participated in, the workshops she'd taken, the novel she'd been working on for the past 2 years. She explained that all those early bedtimes were actually late-night writing sessions. She'd been getting up at 4 a.m. to write for a few hours before getting ready for work. The obsessive organisation, the anxiety about routine changes, the reluctance to make social plans, it all made sense now. She'd been protecting her writing time, creating structure around this secret passion that required discipline and consistency. "I never meant to lie to you," she said through tears. "I just didn't know how to bring it up. At first it felt too personal to share. Then as time went on, it felt too weird to suddenly mention this huge part of my life that I'd never talked about before." Or, I understood her reasoning, but I was still hurt. Not by the writing itself, but by the secrecy. By the fact that she'd felt she couldn't trust me with something so important to her. By all the opportunities we'd missed to celebrate her successes together. We spent the rest of that weekend talking about her writing, about why she'd felt the need to hide it, about how we could better support each other's individual interests and goals. I read more of her work, and it was genuinely impressive. She had a unique voice and perspective that I'd never seen in our daily interactions. Lisa showed me rejection letters she'd received from prestigious literary magazines, and I could see how much each one had stung. She'd been dealing with the emotional roller coaster of the creative life completely alone, celebrating small victories and processing disappointments without the support of her partner. The experience forced both of us to examine our relationship more closely. Had I been so focused on our shared life that I'd neglected to nurture her individual identity? Had she been so afraid of judgment that she'd chosen isolation over vulnerability? We decided to make some changes. Lisa set up a proper writing space in our spare room, and we established boundaries around her writing time. I started reading more about the publishing industry so I could better understand the world she was navigating. She began sharing her work with me regularly, asking for feedback and letting me celebrate her successes. The transformation in our relationship has been remarkable. Lisa seems more confident, more herself, now that she doesn't have to compartmentalize such a huge part of her identity. I feel like I'm getting to know my wife all over again, discovering depths and talents I never knew existed. She's currently shopping a novel to agents, and while the process is stressful and full of uncertainty, we're facing it together this time. Whether she gets published or not, I'm proud of her dedication and talent. I'm also grateful for what this experience has taught us about the importance of maintaining individual identities within a marriage. Looking back, I realised that Lisa's secrecy wasn't really about not trusting me. It was about protecting something precious and fragile until she felt confident enough to share it. In a way, I understand why she kept it to herself initially. Creative work is so personal, so vulnerable, that sharing it feels like exposing your soul. But I've also learned that partnerships require radical honesty, even about the parts of ourselves we're still figuring out. By hiding her writing life, Lisa had been carrying a burden that should have been shared. By supporting each other's individual passions, we've actually strengthened our bond as a couple. These days, I love watching Lisa work on her stories, seeing the concentration on her face as she crafts sentences and develops characters. It's like witnessing magic happen. And knowing that I get to be part of this journey with her, even if I came into it later than I should have, feels like a privilege. Sometimes the people we think we know completely still have entire worlds inside them waiting to be discovered. What a beautiful story about how, even in the strongest relationships, we can still surprise each other. It's amazing how she built this entire creative life in secret, and honestly, it makes sense why she protected it for so long. Creative work is so vulnerable. If you're still here listening to these stories, it means you're probably finding that perfect sleepy headspace we were going for. Consider subscribing if these late night story sessions are helping you unwind. There's always more where these came from. Now here's a story that really caught my attention about workplace dynamics and what happens when kindness gets taken advantage of. My name is Catherine, I'm 29, and I work as a marketing coordinator at a small tech startup in Austin. We're the kind of company that prides itself on being a family. You know the type: ping pong tables, free snacks, casual dress code, and everyone's supposed to be best friends. For the most part, I genuinely enjoyed the atmosphere there. My co-workers were smart, funny, and we all seemed to genuinely care about each other's well-being. About 8 months ago, we hired a new graphic designer named Tom. He was 24, fresh out of college, enthusiastic about everything, and honestly just seemed grateful to have landed his first real job in his field. Tom was the kind of person who'd volunteer for extra projects, stay late to help meet deadlines, and always brought homemade cookies to share on Fridays. From his first week, it was clear that Tom was struggling financially. His clothes were always clean, but obviously worn. He never joined us for lunch outings because he said he was trying to save money, and he'd get visibly stressed whenever anyone mentioned weekend plans that cost money. It wasn't hard to piece together that he was probably living paycheck to paycheck, maybe even less than that. I felt for him. I remembered what it was like being 24 and broke in an expensive city, trying to make it in a competitive field. So when Tom mentioned one day that his car had broken down and he couldn't afford to fix it, I offered to give him rides to and from work until he got it sorted out. He was incredibly grateful, almost embarrassingly so, and promised it would just be for a few days. Those few days turned into a few weeks. Tom's car situation seemed to get more complicated every time I asked about it. First, it was waiting for a part. Then the mechanic had to order something special. Then there was an issue with his insurance covering the repairs. I didn't mind at first. Tom lived only about 15 minutes out of my way, and he was always ready and waiting when I arrived, usually with a coffee for me as a thank you gesture. But gradually, the arrangement started expanding beyond just work rides. Tom would mention that he needed to stop by the grocery store. Could we swing by on the way home? He had a doctor's appointment that he couldn't reschedule. Could I possibly give him a ride there during lunch? His sister was visiting, and he wanted to show her around the city. Would it be too much trouble to drive them to a few places over the weekend? Each request came with profuse apologies and promises that this would be the last time, that his car would definitely be fixed soon. And honestly, I'm a people pleaser by nature. It felt good to help someone who was clearly struggling, and Tom was always so appreciative that it made me feel like I was doing something meaningful. The turning point came about 3 months into this arrangement. I was supposed to pick Tom up for work as usual, but when I arrived at his apartment complex, he wasn't waiting outside like normal. I texted him, no response, called him, went straight to voicemail. I waited for about 20 minutes, getting increasingly worried that something had happened to him. Finally, he came jogging out of his building, hair still wet from the shower, looking completely frazzled. He jumped in the car and immediately started apologizing, saying he'd overslept, his alarm didn't go off, he was so sorry for making me late. I was annoyed but tried to be understanding. Everyone oversleeps sometimes. But then it happened again the following week, and the week after that. Tom started treating me less like someone doing him a favour, and more like his personal chauffeur service. He'd text me with requests like, "Can you pick me up at 8:15 instead of 8:30 tomorrow? I have an early meeting," without asking if that worked for my schedule. He'd assume I was available for weekend errands and get genuinely confused when I said I had other plans. The final straw came on a Friday afternoon. Tom asked if I could drive him to run some errands after work. Nothing major, just a quick stop at the bank and maybe the pharmacy. I agreed, thinking it would take maybe an hour total. Instead, Tom directed me to stop after stop across the city. The bank, the pharmacy, a specialty electronics store where he spent 45 minutes comparing prices on headphones, a used bookstore where he browsed for another half hour, and finally a restaurant where he'd arranged to meet some friends for dinner. When we pulled up to the restaurant, Tom thanked me cheerfully and started to get out of the car. I sat there for a moment, realizing that he expected me to just drive home alone while he enjoyed dinner with friends. I'd spent 3 hours on a Friday evening being his unpaid Uber driver, and he hadn't even thought to invite me to join them or ask if this was inconvenient for me. "Tom," I said before he could close the car door, "I need to talk to you about this arrangement we have." "Why, he looked surprised, like he couldn't imagine what I might want to discuss. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "This car situation has been going on for months now. I don't mind helping you out, but it's starting to feel like I'm your personal driver rather than a co-worker doing you a favour." Tom's expression shifted from confusion to defensiveness. "I didn't realise you felt that way. I thought you were okay with helping me out." "I always say thank you." "You do say thank you," I agreed. "But Tom, I've been driving you around for 3 months. You've never offered to pay for gas. You've never suggested we take turns with something I might need help with. And you've started making requests like I'm obligated to say yes." He was quiet for a moment, and I thought maybe he was finally understanding my perspective. Instead, he said, "I can't believe you're making me feel guilty for accepting help that you offered. If it was such a problem, why didn't you say something sooner?" I was stunned by how quickly he'd turned this around to make me the bad guy. "I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. I'm trying to have an honest conversation about boundaries. Look, I'm sorry if I took advantage," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't really think he had. "But my car is almost fixed, and then this won't be an issue anymore." That was 4 months ago. Tom's car was never fixed because Tom never had a broken car. I found this out through a mutual friend who happened to live in Tom's apartment complex. Apparently, Tom had been parking his perfectly functional Honda Civic in the visitor spots instead of paying for a monthly parking pass and walking to the pickup spot where I'd been collecting him every morning. When I confronted him about this, Tom finally admitted the truth. His car worked fine, but he'd been struggling to afford gas and parking, and it seemed easier to accept rides than to figure out the logistics of driving himself. He'd been planning to tell me eventually, he said, but the longer it went on, the harder it became to come clean. I was furious, not just about the lying, but about how he'd manipulated my kindness for months, without any consideration for my time or my feelings. I told him the rides were over, effective immediately, and that I needed some space to process what had happened. The fallout at work was awkward. Tom seemed to expect that we'd just go back to normal after a few days, but I found it hard to trust him or want to spend time with him. He started making comments to other co-workers about how I'd abandoned him when he needed help, painting himself as the victim of my sudden change of heart. Eventually, our manager noticed the tension and asked if there was a problem between us. I explained the situation objectively, focusing on how it had affected my work schedule and my ability to stay late when needed. Tom was called in for a separate conversation, and while I don't know exactly what was said, his attitude toward me shifted after that. He never directly apologized for lying to me or for taking advantage of my generosity. Instead, he started being overly professional and distant, like I was the one who had wronged him. It was clear that he genuinely didn't understand why I was upset or why what he'd done was problematic. The experience taught me a lot about setting boundaries and recognizing when someone is taking advantage of your kindness. Tom wasn't malicious exactly, but he was selfish and immature. He saw my willingness to help as an opportunity to solve his problems without considering the cost to me or the dishonesty involved in his approach. I still help co-workers when they need it, but I'm more careful about ongoing commitments and more direct about my expectations. If someone needs a ride to work for a week while their car is in the shop, that's one thing. If someone wants me to be their permanent transportation solution while lying about their circumstances, that's something else entirely. Tom still works at our company, and we maintain a polite but distant professional relationship. He found other ways to get to work, which proves he was always capable of solving his transportation issues without my help. Sometimes I wonder if he ever understood why I was so hurt by his deception, or if he still thinks I was just being mean to someone who needed help. The whole experience reminded me that kindness without boundaries isn't really kindness at all. It's just enabling someone to avoid taking responsibility for their own problems while creating resentment on both sides. That story is absolutely infuriating. The audacity of lying about a broken car for months while using someone as a free taxi service is just wild. Some people really will take advantage of any kindness they can get their hands on. Here's our next story, and this one deals with a situation that's probably more common than we'd like to admit. What happens when you discover something about your partner that completely changes how you see them? I'm 26 years old, my name is Jordan, and I've been with my boyfriend Kevin for about 2.5 years. We moved in together 8 months ago, and for the most part, everything has been great. Kevin is funny, thoughtful, ambitious, and we share a lot of the same interests and values. Or at least, I thought we did until last month when I discovered something that's been eating at me ever since. Kevin works in sales for a medical device company, and he's really good at his job. He's consistently one of their top performers, makes excellent money, and genuinely seems to enjoy the work. He travels occasionally for conferences and client meetings, but nothing excessive. Maybe once or twice a month, usually just overnight trips to nearby cities. I work remotely as a content manager for a digital marketing agency, so I'm home most of the time. This arrangement has worked well for us because I can be flexible with my schedule, and Kevin doesn't have to worry about things like letting repair people in or receiving packages when he's travelling. About 6 weeks ago, Kevin had to go to a conference in Denver for 3 days. It was a big industry event that he'd been looking forward to, and he'd been preparing for weeks, putting together presentations and setting up meetings with potential clients. He left on a Wednesday morning, excited and optimistic about the business opportunities. The first 2 days went normally. Kevin would call me in the evenings to tell me about the sessions he'd attended, the people he'd met, how the conference was going. He sounded engaged and professional, exactly what I'd expect from someone at a work event. But on Friday, something felt off. Kevin called me around lunchtime, and he sounded different, not sick exactly, but tired and a little scattered. He said the conference was wrapping up earlier than expected, and he might be able to catch an earlier flight home. I was excited about the prospect of having him back for Friday night instead of Saturday morning. A few hours later, Kevin called again to say he'd managed to switch his flight and would be home by 8 p.m. I decided to surprise him by making his favourite dinner and picking up a bottle of wine. I wanted to hear all about the conference and celebrate what sounded like a successful trip. Kevin got home right on schedule, but something was immediately wrong. He looked exhausted, more than you'd expect from a few days of meetings and networking. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair was messy, and he had this strange, almost guilty expression on his face. When I hugged him hello, I noticed he smelled different. Not bad exactly, but unfamiliar, like a perfume or lotion I didn't recognise mixed with cigarette smoke, which was weird because Kevin doesn't smoke, and usually avoids places where people are smoking. During dinner, Kevin was distracted and gave vague answers to my questions about the conference. When I asked about specific sessions or people he'd mentioned earlier, he seemed confused, like he couldn't quite remember what he'd told me. He kept checking his phone and seemed anxious in a way I'd never seen before. I chalked it up to travel exhaustion and maybe some post-conference social anxiety. Kevin can be introverted in large groups, so I figured he was just drained from 3 days of networking and small talk. But over the next few days, Kevin continued acting strange. He was jumpy when his phone rang, secretive about his emails, and seemed distracted during conversations. When I asked if everything was okay, he insisted he was just tired and stressed about follow-up work from the conference. The truth came out by accident 2 weeks later. I was doing laundry and found a receipt in Kevin's pants pocket from his Denver trip. Normally, I wouldn't think twice about it, but something made me look closer. It was from a restaurant called Bella Vista, dated for Friday night, the night Kevin had supposedly caught an early flight home. I stared at that receipt for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Kevin had definitely been home by 8 p.m. on Friday. I remembered because we'd had dinner together and watched a movie, but according to this receipt, he'd been at a restaurant in Denver at 9:30 p.m. that same night. I confronted Kevin about the receipt that evening, trying to give him a chance to explain what seemed like an obvious mistake. Maybe the restaurant had printed the wrong date, or maybe it was from a different trip. Kevin's reaction told me everything I needed to know. His face went pale, then red, and he got that same guilty expression I'd noticed the night he came home. He stared at the receipt like it was evidence of a crime. "I can explain," he said, but then he didn't say anything for a long moment. I waited, my heart pounding, knowing that whatever explanation was coming would change everything between us. Finally, Kevin admitted that he hadn't come home Friday night. He'd stayed in Denver an extra day and flown back Saturday morning, then spent several hours at the airport and driving around before coming home Friday evening. "Why would you lie about that?" I asked, though I was starting to suspect I didn't want to know the answer. Kevin broke down and told me the truth. He hadn't been at a medical device conference at all. He'd been at a gambling conference, learning about sports betting strategies and meeting with people who made their living from gambling. The business meetings he'd been so excited about were actually sessions on reading odds and managing betting bankrolls. I was completely blindsided. In 2.5 years together, Kevin had never shown any interest in gambling. He'd never mentioned sports betting, never talked about going to casinos, never even bought lottery tickets, as far as I knew. Yet apparently, he'd been living this entire secret life that I knew nothing about. As the truth came out over the following hours, I learned that Kevin had been gambling online for over a year, not just occasionally, but regularly, sometimes daily. He'd been using a separate bank account that I didn't know about, funded by a portion of his sales commissions that he'd been hiding from me. The Denver trip wasn't his first gambling-related travel. He'd been to Las Vegas twice in the past year, telling me they were work trips. He'd been attending monthly poker games with a group of guys from work, claiming they were just casual team-building dinners. Kevin insisted that he wasn't addicted, that he was actually pretty good at it and had made money overall. He showed me spreadsheets tracking his wins and losses, detailed analyses of his betting strategies, even testimonials from other gamblers who considered him skilled. But as he talked, I realised that whether he was winning or losing wasn't really the point. The point was that he'd been lying to me about a major part of his life for over a year. He'd created elaborate cover stories, hidden financial accounts, and deceived me about his whereabouts and activities on a regular basis. "Why didn't you just tell me?" I asked. "If you enjoy it and you're good at it, why keep it secret?" Kevin said he knew I wouldn't understand, that I'd worry about him losing money or developing a gambling problem. He said he wanted to prove to himself that he could be successful at it before bringing me into that world. I tried to understand his perspective, but I kept coming back to the fundamental dishonesty. Kevin had looked me in the eye countless times and lied about where he was going, what he was doing, who he was with. He'd created an entire fictional version of his life to hide something he was passionate about. The worst part was realizing how many of our conversations had been built on lies. All those times he'd come home from work trips and told me about presentations he'd given or clients he'd met, none of it had been real. I'd been supportive and interested in this fictional career development, while he was actually pursuing something completely different. We've been trying to work through this for the past month, but I'm struggling with the trust issues. Kevin has been completely transparent since the truth came out, showing me his accounts, explaining his strategies, even inviting me to come with him to poker games. But I can't shake the feeling that if he could lie about this so convincingly for so long, what else might he be hiding? The gambling itself doesn't bother me as much as I thought it would. Kevin wasn't exaggerating when he said he was good at it. He's actually made a significant profit over the past year. It's clearly something he's passionate about and has studied seriously. In some ways, it's not that different from any other hobby that requires skill and strategy. But the deception has created a crack in our relationship that I don't know how to repair. Every time Kevin goes somewhere or tells me about his day, I find myself wondering if he's telling the truth or if this is another elaborate cover story. Kevin says he understands why I'm having trouble trusting him, and he's committed to being completely honest going forward. He's even suggested couples counselling to help us work through the trust issues. Part of me wants to try to rebuild what we had, because aside from this massive deception, our relationship has been really good. But part of me wonders if this is just who Kevin is, someone who compartmentalizes his life and creates fictional narratives when the truth seems inconvenient, someone who can look at the person he loves and lie convincingly about fundamental aspects of his life. I don't know if trust can be rebuilt after something like this, or if I'll always be waiting for the next revelation about who Kevin really is underneath the version of himself he shows me. The fact that he maintained such an elaborate lie for over a year makes me question everything I thought I knew about him, and I'm not sure how to move forward from that kind of fundamental uncertainty about your partner's character. Wow, that's such a complex situation. The gambling itself almost seems secondary to the fact that he built an entire fictional life and maintained it for over a year. That level of deception would shake anyone's foundation of trust. Let me share one more story with you before we wrap up tonight. This one is about family dynamics and the sometimes painful process of setting boundaries with people you love. My name is Rachel, I'm 32, and I'm the middle child in a family of 5 kids. Growing up, our house was controlled chaos, always someone needing a ride somewhere, always some drama or crisis that required all hands on deck, always the feeling that there wasn't quite enough attention or resources to go around. My parents did their best, but they were overwhelmed. Dad worked long hours as an electrician, and Mum was basically a single parent most of the time, trying to manage 5 kids ranging from my older brother Daniel, who was always getting in trouble, to my youngest sister Amy, who was born when I was 12 and required a lot of care and attention. As the middle child, I learned early that the best way to survive in our household was to be helpful and invisible. While Daniel was acting out and demanding attention through negative behaviour, and my younger siblings were getting attention just by virtue of being small and needy, I carved out my role as the responsible one, the helper, the kid who never caused problems. This dynamic followed me into adulthood. Even after I moved out, got married and started my own life, I remained the family problem solver. When Daniel got arrested, I was the one who researched lawyers and helped navigate the legal system. When my parents couldn't afford to fix their car, I quietly lent them money. When Amy was struggling in high school, I was the one who helped her with college applications and drove her to campus visits. I told myself this was just what families do for each other, that I was lucky to be in a position to help when others needed it. My husband Jake was supportive, though he occasionally pointed out that my family seemed to have an unusual number of emergencies that required my immediate attention and often my financial assistance. The breaking point came 6 months ago during what should have been a celebration. Jake and I had been trying to have a baby for 3 years, going through fertility treatments, dealing with multiple miscarriages, and finally, we were 12 weeks pregnant with a healthy baby. We'd just had our first ultrasound and were ready to share the news with our families. I called my mum to tell her she was going to be a grandmother again, expecting tears of joy, excitement, maybe some questions about due dates and baby names. Instead, before I could even finish sharing my news, Mum interrupted me. "Oh, honey, that's wonderful, but I need to talk to you about something urgent. Daniel's in trouble again, and we need your help." I felt like I'd been slapped. I'd just shared the most important news of my life, something Jake and I had been hoping and praying for through years of disappointment, and my mother's response was to immediately redirect the conversation to my brother's latest crisis. "Mum," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I just told you I'm pregnant. Can we talk about Daniel after we talk about this?" "Of course, sweetie. I'm so happy for you," she said quickly, in a tone that suggested she was checking a box so we could move on to what she considered the real conversation. Now about Daniel. It turned out that Daniel, who was 34 years old and had been in and out of legal trouble for most of his adult life, had been arrested again. This time for driving under the influence, and because he had previous convictions, he was facing serious jail time. Mum wanted me to hire him a lawyer, help with bail money, and possibly let him stay with Jake and me while he got back on his feet. I listened to this request with a growing sense of disbelief. My mother had just brushed past my pregnancy announcement to ask me to financially and emotionally support my adult brother through another self-inflicted crisis. She was asking me to bring a person with addiction and legal problems into my home while I was pregnant, after years of fertility struggles. "Mum, I can't do that," I said. "Jake and I need to focus on our pregnancy and preparing for the baby. Daniel needs to handle this himself." The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. Then came the guilt trip I'd been receiving in various forms my entire life. "I can't believe you're abandoning your brother when he needs you most." "This is what family does, Rachel. We help each other. I thought I raised you better than this." That phrase, "I thought I raised you better than this," had been weaponized against me countless times over the years. Any time I tried to set boundaries or prioritize my own life, I'd been told I was selfish, that I was forgetting where I came from, that I wasn't living up to the family values I'd been taught. But this time, something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the pregnancy hormones. Maybe it was years of accumulated resentment. Or maybe it was just the stark clarity of realizing that my mother cared more about my brother's latest crisis than about my long-awaited pregnancy. "Actually, Mum, you raised me to believe that I was responsible for everyone else's problems and that my own needs didn't matter. But that's not healthy, and it's not fair, and I'm done." I hung up the phone and immediately burst into tears. Jake held me while I sobbed, not just from the immediate hurt of my mother's reaction, but from the dawning realization of how dysfunctional my family dynamic had always been. Over the next few days, I received a barrage of calls and texts from various family members. My father called to tell me I was breaking my mother's heart. My sister Amy texted to say she couldn't believe I was being so selfish when Daniel really needed help this time. Even my grandmother got involved, calling to remind me that family comes first and that I'd regret not helping my brother. The message was clear. I was the villain in this story. By refusing to drop everything and rescue Daniel from the consequences of his own actions, I was the one causing problems for the family. But something had shifted in me. For the first time in my life, I was seeing the pattern clearly. Daniel created crises, the family panicked, and I was expected to fix everything while my own life and needs were treated as secondary. This had been happening for decades, and I'd been so conditioned to accept it that I'd never questioned whether it was fair or healthy. I spent the next few weeks in therapy, talking through these family dynamics with a professional who helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't normal family closeness, but a form of emotional manipulation called parentification. I'd been trained from childhood to take responsibility for problems that weren't mine to solve. The hardest part was accepting that my family's love for me might be conditional on my willingness to continue playing this role. As long as I was the helpful, self-sacrificing daughter and sister, I was valued and appreciated. The moment I tried to set boundaries and prioritize my own life, I became the selfish one who was abandoning the family. I decided to maintain my boundaries, even though it meant accepting that my relationships with my family members might fundamentally change. I didn't hire Daniel a lawyer, I didn't contribute to his bail fund, and I didn't offer him a place to stay. Instead, I focused on my pregnancy, my marriage, and building a healthier life for the family Jake and I were creating. The consequences were swift and painful. My mother stopped calling me regularly. When I'd reach out to check in, our conversations were stilted and cold. She'd give me updates about everyone else in the family, but seemed to have little interest in how I was doing or how my pregnancy was progressing. My siblings' reactions varied. Amy initially took Mum's side, but after a few weeks, she called to apologise and said she was starting to see the pattern too. She admitted that she'd been feeling pressure to step into my old role as the family fixer, and she didn't want that responsibility either. My older brother Daniel, surprisingly, wasn't as angry as I'd expected. When he finally called me from jail, he actually apologised for the position I'd been put in. "I know this isn't your mess to clean up," he said. "I'm sorry Mum made you feel bad about not bailing me out again." It was the most mature conversation Daniel and I had ever had, and it gave me hope that maybe, eventually, we could have a healthier relationship based on mutual respect rather than one-sided rescue missions. Dad was caught in the middle, as usual. He understood why I'd set boundaries, but he was also dealing with Mum's disappointment and anger. He tried to play peacemaker, suggesting compromises that would appease everyone. But I'd finally learned that some situations don't have compromise solutions. The real test came when I was 7 months pregnant and went into preterm labour. I spent 3 days in the hospital on bed rest, scared and uncertain about whether our baby would be okay. Jake called my family to let them know what was happening, thinking that a medical emergency might bridge the gap that had formed between us. My dad and Amy came to visit, bringing flowers and genuine concern, but my mother's response was telling. She sent a text message saying she was sorry I was having complications and that she hoped everything would work out. A text message for her daughter, who was potentially losing a much-wanted baby after years of fertility struggles. That's when I realised that my mother's love had always been conditional on my compliance. When I was useful to her, when I was solving other people's problems and putting the family's needs above my own, she was warm and affectionate. But the moment I prioritised my own life and well-being, I became dispensable to her. It was a painful realisation, but also a liberating one. I stopped feeling guilty about my boundaries and started feeling grateful that I'd discovered this pattern before bringing my own child into it. My daughter was born healthy at 37 weeks, and she's now 6 months old and absolutely perfect. My mother has met her granddaughter exactly twice, both times for brief, awkward visits, where she seemed more interested in getting photos for social media than in actually bonding with the baby. Meanwhile, My relationships with Dad and Amy have actually improved. Without the constant drama of Daniel's crises and Mum's demands for family rescues, we've been able to have more genuine conversations about our lives, our hopes, our individual challenges. Amy has started setting her own boundaries with Mum, and Dad has begun to see how the family dynamic was unhealthy for everyone involved. Daniel got sober in jail and has been clean for 4 months now. He's working with a counsellor and taking responsibility for his actions in a way he never did before. Ironically, not rescuing him might have been the best thing I could have done for him, because it forced him to face the consequences of his choices and develop his own coping strategies. As for my relationship with my mother, I'm still hopeful that it can be repaired someday, but only if she's willing to accept that I'm an adult with my own family and my own priorities. I'm not holding my breath, but I'm also not closing the door completely. The experience taught me that sometimes loving your family means refusing to enable their dysfunction, even when that choice makes you the villain in their story. Setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's necessary for maintaining your mental health and creating space for healthy relationships to flourish. My daughter will grow up knowing that she's loved unconditionally, not because of what she can do for other people, but because of who she is. She'll learn that it's okay to have needs and boundaries, and that healthy families support each other without keeping score or demanding sacrifices that compromise